Okay, well, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Chris. My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator for Illinois Extension. I'm based out of Champaign County in central Illinois. And I've experience as a forester and an arborist. So today I hope to, so forestry is kind of the care of trees as a system, as an ecosystem, and arboriculture is kind of that care of an individual tree in your yard, in your park, looking at it on an individual scale. So today I hope to kind of bring you a combination of my experience from years of tree planting and many acres of tree planting I've done over the years, and my experience as an arborist dealing with trees in the urban setting and tree care and all the issues that go along with that. So first thing I'd like to start with discussing is just why do we plant trees? What's the reason? What are the best situations for planting trees? Reforestation of cropland is something in Illinois we do quite a bit. So that's a great place for tree planting. We also restocking a forest stand. So after a storm or other disturbance that creates openings, we can go into an existing forest stand. We can add trees in a couple different ways. We can protect or enhance water resources. So whether it's wetland restoration, where we're restoring acres of wetlands with forest cover, or whether it's a riparian buffer, so an area that protects a stream, trees that we plant along the edge of a stream that help provide a buffer between that stream and other land uses, or simply to diversify wildlife habitat. So there's times that we plant a woodland edge to kind of diversify the plants in that edge area. So the edge is where that woodland meets cropland or a prairie or some other type of land use. So we can kind of diversify that by adding native trees and shrubs there. Or windbreaks are something that we do a lot in central Illinois. It's really flat and really windy here. So we can add a nice diverse windbreak as a form of tree planting. Or finally, just to increase diversity in existing stand. And I'll talk about that a little bit today. If we have a stand where we don't have the understory that we want, we can add trees in a number of different ways to that stand. So all of this assessment of what you do for tree planting starts with kind of site assessment. So this map here shows an area close to my house that I've always wanted to plant trees on. So I went ahead and I'll kind of go through how I would determine exactly what tree species I select for that site. So one of the really important factors for that are what soils are present on the site. And despite the fact that there may be topographic features and things that are out there that we can really easily, clearly define different areas. In this case, this site's along the Sangamon River, so it's very flooded. So I can easily see where this site floods year to year, but I don't necessarily know all the different soil types in an upland setting or other settings. So we need to identify those soils to understand what trees go there. We need to understand the drainage. In this case, this site is half inundated with floodwaters for a good chunk of the spring each year. There's probably actually some water on it right now. And finally, as part of this initial site assessment, weeds are going to be our big competitors. We've got to identify those weeds. We've got to come into our tree planting with a plan of action for how we're going to control those. So let's start by picking apart kind of the soils data. And there's a couple different places where we can get that information. Nowadays, a lot of the, on the right there, you see the old county soil surveys. Those were printed hard copy things that were done for every county in Illinois, and they describe the soils well. There's a ton of information. They are super thick books. All of that information, for the most part, has been condensed now into the web soil survey. So that's, if you go to web soil survey on the internet and you click on that Start WWSS button there, it's an interactive mapping tool where you can find the exact field you're looking at, and you can access most all of this soils data. So that's what I did here. Is on the left, I went into web soil survey and I found this, the field in question, and you can see where it's delineated the different soil map units. So we have quite a few different map units where, again, this is kind of the flooded area. The Sangamon River is right down here and it's meandering through. We can't see it. It's off the screen some, but all this floodwater comes in and really covers a lot of both of these lower two soil map units right here, where as we get a little further uphill, we'll see these are a little bit more upland soils where, again, you can really see on this site with that topography. You can also tell this area was not planted to the same thing as down here. So there's a little bit of change in management there due to that flooding. So when we look at a little more detail here on the different map units that we're seeing, the soil survey tells us quite a bit in just this one little table right here that, kind of describes that map unit name, where we can see, the symbol on the map is 322B for this particular soil. And that's Russell silt loam, which is, 2 to 5% slopes and is a pretty well-drained soil. That's our most upland soil on this site. That's kind of the highest point on the site, and we're going downhill from there. So if we look at the description on a lot of these other map units, we can see, some of these are frequently flooded, occasionally flooded. So just right there in the name of that soil map unit, we can kind of understand, how sloped it is. We can understand some of the drainage there, which is really important that we get, as we look at what tree species might fit on the site. So for our more flooded map units here, I've pulled another table out of the soil survey, and this is accessible for any county, for any map unit in the state. This is actually some data when we start looking at these suggested trees to plant, that you really have to go back to the old printed soil surveys, which are again available in hard copy, getting more and more infrequent, but you can find them all on the internet as a PDF. So you can go download that old hard copy as a PDF, and you can find this table in the back of the soil survey that tells, by map unit, it tells us the suggested trees to plant. So we can see on these more flooded sites, they're suggesting things like swamp white oak, sweet gum, hackberry, cottonwood, some of those plants that can handle, quite a bit of inundation and flooding. Whereas if we look at this same table for our more upland soils, it's an entirely different set of suggested trees to plant that NRCS is recommending. So, everything from black walnut to white oak and tulip poplar are recommended for that particular map unit. So this kind of gets us in the ballpark of what species might fit on the site. And it takes a little more interpretation when you look at plant lists and when you look at all the native tree species we could potentially plant to kind of fit them to your site, but it gives you a good idea. White oak's going to do well there. Other trees with similar needs can also do well there. So a lot of the oak species are going to do well on this site. And there's great lists that show, by flood tolerance, by different tolerances, how these species would fit on a site. So you can start to kind of correlate things there. If you're just starting from scratch, trying to figure out, okay, what trees do we plant on the site? This is kind of the way that I always start, is by looking at soils and kind of by assessing this list of recommended species and trying to apply a plant list that I think is equal to that. So next, we need to identify weeds. And really, a common misconception with trees is that grass and trees work well together. We see them in an urban setting a lot. There's often grass right up to the base of a tree trunk, but in all honesty, grass is probably the most competitive plant with the tree. And that's because, as you can see from this picture down here, grasses have this really dense mat of roots, often in that upper 6 inches of soil or so. Whereas, tree roots are concentrated in the upper, and these two pictures are not to scale. That's about 6 inches, where here we have feet. So tree roots are really concentrated in that upper, 12 to 18 inches of soil, where I really don't like the diagrams you see where it's a mirror image of a tree underground as well as above ground. That's really inaccurate. So when you have that dense layer of roots on top of grass roots on top of tree roots, when we just get a little bit of rain, the grass gets all that rain. So, and the tree's left without that. So that the grass is really intercepting a lot of the rainfall and taking up a lot of the nutrients before our trees can get it. So that's probably the biggest thing in weed management, is just really controlling those grass species, eliminating any grass, fescues established on the site. Say it's an old pasture, say it's a mowed area, probably going to have a lot of cool season grasses. Really important that we control those ahead of time. And so we're going to control grasses, and we're going to manage for those weaker annual weeds, those things that come in after we kill the grass, those things that are, a lot of annual weeds have just a smaller, weaker root system. They produce a lot of seed as their goal, and are, again, annual. So they die each year over the winter time. So they don't have that really thick, well-established root system. So that's what we're going for in managing weeds, is really keeping those annual weeds on the site and grasses out. Invasive species is another big issue, and it's getting to be a worse and worse issue every year, it seems like. So autumn olive's one I picture here, but here's kind of a list of gosh, just a tiny, tiny list of the invasives that could be present on a tree planting site or could cause some problems. Calorie pear you see pictured there, that's also referred to as Bradford pear. That's a variety of calorie pear, is Bradford. So a lot of us may know it as Bradford pear, but it's becoming a bigger issue in tree plantings and areas with open sunlight. Whereas, you know, I have bush honeysuckle and burning bush listed there. They tend to be on a little more shade tolerant sites and in some of the locations that have a little more shade, although I've seen them both in full sun locations where, you know, here's a couple invasive grass species, reed canary grass, Phragmites. Those are both probably in more of a wetland setting is where we would see those grasses. But if either are present, that needs to be our first step. If any of these invasives are present, our first step needs to be absolutely controlling and eliminating them before we start tree planting, or you wind up with this mixture of invasives and trees we want, and it gets really difficult to control those invasives when they're kind of commingled. So let's talk about site preparation. So that's a forestry term for getting this place ready for tree planting. So there's, you know, a lot of different ways we can accomplish this, and some of it has to do with whether or not you have a tractor and equipment and a large enough planting site that you need a lot of site preparation like tillage. Or if you're like me, I've done a lot of forest restoration on my property with a lot of hand tools and other things. So it's really just, you know, again, getting the grass species out of the planting area, controlling invasive species, and depending on our planting methods, which I'll talk about planting methods in detail a little later today, really getting that area prepared for whatever we need to do to access the site for tree planting. So there's a lot of different techniques, again, from mechanical things like tillage and mowing. You can see a couple different pieces of equipment that can do that, to chemical. You know, application of herbicides is often really one of the best ways we can get a site really prepared for little weed pressure ahead of tree planting. Burning is another one of those options, which is great in a place where we have a lot of material we need to consume ahead of time, but there are a lot of inherent dangers with burning. You have to know what you're doing, and you have to be able to contain that controlled burn well. So certainly that's recommended for folks with experience in that area only. And a lot of times we use kind of a combination of all these different methods to get the site prepared and the control over weeds that we need. So that's usually what we're focused on here in site prep, is just how do we get the initial control of those weeds accomplished? So in selecting different tree species, what are some of our goals? What should some of our goals be, or what's the overarching idea behind the tree species we might select? Well, we want to select species that are well suited to the site. So we've kind of covered that. So we can use the soil survey recommendations as a data point. We can look at neighboring sites. If you're reforesting an area that has other forest around it, what are some of your neighboring forest tree compositions? So you can look at that and kind of compare, think about the location of the landscape your planting site is, find another location on the landscape that's forested that is in a similar setting, a similar slope, with respect to what angle, the aspect, or what angle that, what direction on the compass that slope faces, and see, you know, what that forest composition looks like, and give you an idea. So we definitely want to plant a diversity of species, and we're really learning that lesson with a lot of invasive species like the emerald ash borer that come through and wipe out an entire tree species. If we planted all ash on a site, that entire site might be dead in the coming years as emerald ash borer gets to your portion of the state. So we want a diversity of species for a resilient planting. Each one of those different tree species has a different specific set of needs that the site can or can't provide. So if we have a lot of different tree species out there, then we can have some species may or may not like the site, and we hopefully have some in our mixture that are well suited and the site fits them perfectly. Also, from a standpoint of supporting wildlife and all these other aspects of ecology, it's great to have a diversity of trees as opposed to just one or two species. As many as possible is usually what I'm going for in my tree species selection. So we also want to plant a local genotype. And what I mean by a genotype is a tree that's acclimated to our area of the country. So there's within a species, if we just look at a single species of trees, a more southern genotype, so trees that are grown in a more southern location express a different set of genes and a different set of characteristics sometimes than trees that are grown of the same species in a northern location and have grown there over time. So we want a seed source that's located within 100 miles north and 200 miles south of our location. And that's not always super easy to find. So we'll talk about that as we get into planting materials and where we find some of these different planting materials. It's not always super easy to find that local genotype. And that's led some folks to collect their own seed and direct seed onto their site to ensure they have that locally adapted genotype. But as with anything, we have to be aware of the availability in those plants in nurseries and seed sources and other things. There can be a bad seed year for a particular species. And so anytime I would write a tree planting plan, I would always build in and plan for some flexibility. If we can't find a certain species, we may have to substitute. Instead of 10 species, we may only have 9 if we can't substitute something similar. So we have to have some flexibility built in based on plant materials available. So where are some places we can find information about native trees? I'm going to share some great resources here with you. These are all available on the internet. With a quick Google search, you can find most of these. This first is an Illinois Extension Forestry publication that recently came out. That's a checklist of Illinois native trees. So it has a great list in it of all of our native tree species, you know, how common it is in the state, the counties, how many counties it's distributed in, and threatened and endangered status. So it lists so if you find a plant that's not on this list, most likely it's not an Illinois native, because I know Jay Hick did a great job of kind of finding all those native species and compiling them into a great list here in one document. So that's kind of my go-to resource for whether I want to check if a plant is native or not. And I guess that's maybe a topic that I should spend a second on, just to stress the fact that we are going for native trees in reforestation practices. We really don't ever want to plant anything non-native. In the case where we're reforesting areas or we're planting trees in Illinois, we really should be focused on native trees because they support our native wildlife and they have an ecological benefit to the state, as opposed to non-native trees that don't support those kind of things. So it's usually natives that I'm looking for. And again, this is kind of like my go-to list for native species. So NRCS has a wide range of great documents available that, you know, kind of tell us how and when to plant trees or apply many different conservation practices that they do in the landscape. So this is one of their technical notes, number 22, that's available on the internet. And it kind of goes through another list of tree species, but has a little bit different information, but it's a list of, you know, a lot of native trees that I'm pretty sure most of this list is native, but I didn't check it for native versus non-native. And I guess the one setting where there's maybe a good excuse to plant some non-native species is in the case of wind blocks. And that's probably the only place where I've ever kind of planted anything non-native in a tree planting that I've planned is for windbreaks or wind blocks. And it's nice to have something evergreen in those. So there's times that we kind of make an exception and add some non-native evergreens. And I would guess if we looked at this NRCS document, that might be anything non-native they would include may just be some of those non-native conifers that do well in Illinois. So site adaptation really in this column here tells us a lot of information in this document where, you know, that first kind of you know, whatever you want to call it, abbreviation there relates to soil conditions. So in this case, you know, American beech is going to need to be on a moderately well-drained soil or a well-drained soil. And if you think back to where we looked at the soil survey information, that's kind of, you know, covered in the soil, in the description of that soil map unit, we can figure out if we have the right soil there. So this is yet another way where we can figure out if a species suited to the site. This second kind of set is full sun versus partial sun. So that can kind of help you understand the relative shade tolerance of this plant. Is it going to tolerate a little bit of shade or not? So that's kind of some of the information included here. USDA Plants Database is a great location for just, you know, information on native status. You can see the range maps here, but they have, I think what they call them are fact sheets. And you can see right here, you could click and download the fact sheet about this species that has a ton of information, a ton of botanical information about, you know, what type of site that plant might grow on, descriptions of the plants. One thing they've added here recently, and I'm not sure, maybe in the last calendar year or so, but is on their range maps. If you're ever wondering, say you're in the northern part of the state and you're not sure if this plant's native to you or not. In this case, this is white oak we're looking at, which is native to all of Illinois, but they have a county by county breakdown of native status as USDA has the information to show us. And so that's just yet another kind of piece of the puzzle as you're picking apart what's native to my area, what's the best, most native plants I can select. This is one of those places that I look at kind of those native range maps, and even down to the county level, USDA now has information in their plants database. Also, for classification purposes, that's kind of the tab I have circled here. This is one of the places I kind of go to find that most current botanical name or scientific name, Latin name, whatever you want to call that name. I feel like USDA does a pretty good job of staying up to date on that. And as you know, if you pay much attention to scientific names of plants, they're kind of ever changing. Some of that has to do with every year, and we learn more about DNA and different classification of plants. And so it's not so much the plants are changing, our information, our knowledge about them is changing a bit. And so from time to time that can change. You may see the scientific name on a plant list that you don't recommend or don't recognize. And here's kind of one of those places where I go to try and figure out what exact species are we talking about here if there's some confusion. And I feel like USDA does a real good job of kind of keeping that area of the website updated. Last couple of resources are just some that I use regularly, really kind of with a little more. The first two from Morton Arboretum and Missouri Botanical Garden are just great, great websites to kind of search for different plants and find information about them, trees included, but also other plants they have great info about. Morton Arboretum does a great job of listing kind of the tolerances for a particular plant and some of its preferences. That's one of the things that I really kind of like, and that kind of relates to planting considerations, where on Missouri Botanical site, they kind of have a botanical description. So they describe how you might identify that plant or characterize the stems. They also talk about kind of tolerances and kind of some other facts about naming conventions and other things I like from there. And finally, Illinois Wildflowers is just a great site for really detailed botanical descriptions. They really do a good job of, if you're a botanist, if you want to identify one oak versus another by the bud characteristics or anything else, they have a lot of really detailed info in there that can get you there, that can help you with that identification. They have a nice section at the end of each plant where it kind of talks about similar species and helps you pick apart other plants you might be seeing that are similar. But I also like that they have some range and habit information. So they describe the kind of the habitat where that plant might live. They have distribution maps, county by county kind of distribution in Illinois. So another source for that. And they have excellent, pretty detailed information on wildlife value of those plants. So I think they call it faunal associations of those plants, where they detail out kind of what insects, what mammals, what plants do we know use these plants, or what animals do we know use these plants. So if you're really interested in planting for wildlife, that's a great source to kind of understand how that plant might be used by wildlife in your area. So now let's talk a little bit about plant materials. So today I'm going to cover kind of three broad categories of different planting stocks. So either direct seeding, where we use, tree seeds and we plant them directly in the ground. Bare root seedlings, which you can see a big bundle of those at the right there. So that's a 1 or 2 year old little seedling there that was pulled out of a nursery and sent to us bare root, and we go plant out in the field. Or finally, containerized stock. So that's stuff that's in, anywhere from a 1 to 3 or 5 gallon pot. Those are probably 5 gallon pots that you kind of see in that picture. And so all three of those different types of planting stock have very different requirements for how we install them, how we care for them ahead of time and after the fact. So we do want to, again, kind of select plant materials that are suited to our site. And I hope to kind of list some of those ideas here as we go through it. What are some good or bad locations to use this type of planting stock as we kind of describe these? And always, availability is kind of one of the challenges in a diverse planting again. And we're kind of, we'll talk about availability in terms of the different types of planting stock too as we go through these slides. So let's start with direct seeding. So again, this is where we take either seed that we've collected or seed that we've purchased from a broker, and we go and directly seed that out onto the planting site. So at a minimum rate, we'd seed around 3,000 seeds per acre. And boy, that sounds like a ton. Well, if we want to broadcast seed these species, we may be anywhere around 5,000 seeds an acre at a minimum, or up to about 15. So it takes quite a bit of seed out there to get a good forest established this way. So, what's our planting depth? It's about 2 times the seed diameter. So with all the different size seeds you see in this picture, that, we maybe have to have a little bit of flexibility for different size seeds and in that planting depth. Our methods can be either rows or, again, broadcast seeding, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. And the timing, really, I feel like fall is best. That's when, if you think about in the natural setting, when are a lot of these seeds, especially from oaks, available and falling and hitting the ground? What would be the natural way that a white oak acorn would land on the forest floor and become a seedling? It would land in the fall. Also, weather is kind of favorable in the fall. We have, mild temperatures and a lot of rainfall typically coming in the winter months to, kind of help that seed, sink into the bed and have plenty of moisture available so it's not sitting there and drying out. So, really, direct seeding is a pretty adaptable method. And quite honestly, we can do it about any time of year that we don't have extremely dry conditions. So on that timing area, notice I mentioned February to June in the spring. Gosh, June's getting pretty hot out, and it's really, we don't have adequate soil moisture probably by about the time June hits. And this all through the summertime, it's probably too hot, too little soil moisture, where again, in the fall, we have a nice window of milder temperatures, adequate soil moisture where we can seed those, we can direct seed again. So, so what are some of the pros and cons of direct seeding? Well, gosh, one of the pros is that it's the cheapest planting material possible. It's pretty cheap to buy buy the seeds. You can actually go out and collect those seeds yourself. If it's kind of a fun project, if you're interested, if you have a small enough planting site that, in a single season, you can collect enough seed. We have a greater planting window, as we'll talk about when we get into some of these other planting materials. We have a much narrower, smaller time of the year where we can plant. So we have a wide ranging window. One of the pros is that it overwhelms predators. I'm going to talk a lot today about controlling predators, controlling competing weeds. We overwhelm the competitors. We're putting out 3,000 to 5,000 or up to almost 15,000 seeds on an acre. And so if hopefully a ton of those germinate, we're overwhelming any herbivore that can come out and try and eat those plants. So we also often can find more species available as seeds than we can in nurseries and as other forms. So that's an additional advantage. If you're going for diversity, this might be a good choice for you, so you can add in as many different seeds as possible. Some of the drawbacks, it really requires consistent weed and wildlife control. We'll talk about that kind of in the next upcoming slides. Finding that exact right planting method is pretty tricky, whether you plant in rows, whether you broadcast. Again, I'll talk about that in a couple of slides, but that can be an issue as well. Also, seed storage, or if you ever do if you collect the seeds and you have to store them, that can be a little bit tricky. Availability may be a challenge, especially in years where we don't have a good seed crop from one species or another. It may be difficult to find a certain species, but anyway, I think the pros of this method definitely outweigh the cons. So if we look at the couple different methods that I've talked about, row planting versus broadcast planting, here I'm trying to kind of paint a picture of how this might work. And really today, as we're going through a lot of this basic information, I'm hoping to give you all kind of if you're thinking about planting a tree planting, if that's something on the agenda for you this year, I'm hoping to give you kind of an overview. And again, all these numbers, I'll give you a resource here at the end where you can grab all those. So this is kind of just to paint the picture for you if you're thinking about it, trying to make a decision on which method you might use. So in row planting, we're going to have rows that are at various different spacings. So here I have a couple examples of how we would put out 3,025 seeds per acre. The first example is if we had this 6-foot row spacing, where we'd have to have seeds in each row 2.4 feet apart, and that would equal our roughly 3,000 seeds per acre. In the second example, we'd have a 9-foot row spacing, and then within the row, we'd have to narrow that spacing down to about 1.6 feet apart to get our roughly 3,000 seeds per acre. So everything's a little bit adjustable in this method, and sometimes that's really dictated by the equipment we might use. And we'll talk about kind of weed control and things in upcoming slides, but mower width or tillage width or some of the equipment needs that we may have really kind of dictate that spacing for us sometimes. So we've talked a little bit about planting depth already, but essentially 2 times seed diameter is the depth we want to plant at. Really kind of that ideal, just optimal range is probably about 2 to 3 inches deep, right about at 2. And on sites where you're really worried about, that soil surface drying out and really drying out that seed as it starts to germinate and grow, maybe going slightly deeper is better than being right at the soil surface. So with broadcast planting, it's kind of a different approach. So we're going to, in one way or another, and this is where it gets tricky, is how you actually broadcast those seeds on the site. But we need a prepared soil surface. So just like you're going to plant wheat, you're going to plant a row crop or something out in that field, we need really like a tilled, prepared soil surface ready for this seed to be broadcast. Broadcasting methods I've seen done just a gazillion different ways, from cyclone spreaders, kind of like you spread grass seed with on a bigger scale, to I've seen a forester in Indiana that uses a modified potato planter to actually put tree seeds in the ground. So I guess that would actually apply to row planting. I'm sorry. But for broadcast planting, there's just a number of different ways. I've seen folks dumping bags of seed out and raking them, but you really have to do something to kind of randomize those seeds before you broadcast them. Either mix them up in a big tub or something, or mix them up in the actual spreader that you're using before you get them out there. But you're going to broadcast those seeds on the surface, and then you're going to disc them in. So you need to disturb the soil, get good seed to soil contact with the disc running over the site at about a 2 or 3 inch depth. And that kind of follows the same depth that we're trying to get, again, in our rows, and that the depth of that trench. And then finally, we're going to cultipact that soil surface. So we're going to roll that soil surface and press it down a little bit with equipment. And that's going to get us that good seed to soil contact. So, these methods I'm describing, if you are a farmer and you have a ton of equipment for soil tillage, for, getting good seed to soil contact, maybe a broadcast planting is a good idea for you. If you're a person like me that just has hand labor to do it, row planting can work wonderfully. Again, we also probably for row planting need to have a prepared soil surface. So we need it really well tilled and just kind of like we'd plant a row crop in. But simply with a planting bar, and I'll show you guys what that piece of equipment is a little later in the talk, or a shovel, you can go along and plant your seeds in the rows. So if you're, do it by hand person like me, row planting might be the best way to do a direct seeding. So let's talk a bit about plant pressure and controlling competing vegetation, because as you can see from this little tiny sprouted seedling at the right there, these seedlings don't have a lot of size. They don't have a lot of energy to compete with grasses and other vegetation that are going to grow right next to them and use sunlight. So when that acorn germinates, there's a good amount of stored energy available right there for the plant to use that it's going to use for a certain amount of time, so it can hang with that other vegetation. But before too long, these little leaves that are forming up at the top have to start photosynthesizing and provide all the energy that plant's going to need. And if it's shaded out, if it's outcompeted for water, that's also a major need. They're just going to drop out of the stand and disappear. So we really need to control everything on that site that is going to compete for at least 3 growing seasons with the direct seeding. And really that's kind of in combination with us monitoring the progress and how many trees, how much regeneration, how many healthy seedlings we're getting on the site. And at the very end of the talk today, I'll have kind of some guidelines for where you should assume a failed plant, when to replant, I think is what I call that slide. It kind of talks about those levels. But mowing alone really is not going to be sufficient. Herbicides are probably the best alternative here for really maintaining, again, annual weeds on the site, not those perennial grasses that have that aggressive root system, but probably herbicides, and probably with the pre-emergent involved that's going, again, a pre-emergence put down before plants emerge for the year, and it stops seeds from emerging. It stops those seeds from germinating and all that weed seed from coming up. So that's an important key to it. And then probably with some post-emergent control as well, if you're using herbicides. So you read about cultivation as possible. So if you are, a producer, a farmer, and you have soil tillage capabilities, cultivation is possible. So if you get your row spacing set right, that you can cultivate in between those rows. I've seen some really successful direct seed plantings that way, but it's probably going to take multiple applications per year to do that, and really have to stay on top of it and not let things get too thick. Another negative side to cultivation is just that as those seedlings get a little bigger, there's probably some root disturbance they experience when you cultivate. So there's a little give and take probably in a lot of these different settings, but that is a possibility, but again, needs to be done on a repeated basis throughout the growing season. So wildlife pressure is probably, in my experience, the #1 cause of failure. And again, plant pressure is heavy, and they can kind of work together to really ruin a tree planting. But these seed predators, mice, squirrels, and chipmunks, and squirrels I have pictured here because, gosh, they can really hammer a tree planting. And I don't know if you guys have dealt with squirrels in your yard or other places, but they are a force of nature. They really are difficult to deter and stop. If a squirrel's determined to do something, it is going to do it. So I've seen a lot of seed predators before our trees even get up, go in and predate those seeds and take care, really ruin the tree planting. As a second threat, the predators, once we have a seedling established, voles especially, but also deer, are really heavy predators once those little seedlings get up. So, what are some recommendations for controlling wildlife pressure? Well, eliminating that desirable habitat for some of the smaller mammals. So voles especially love that heavy grass cover, mice too. Mowing or spraying, probably mowing with spraying is going to be needed to control, that heavy grass, brushy, thick cover. We need to control that. If you have heavy enough residue after mowing, you may need to remove that from the site. So that's kind of a hint that you need to, if you're going to use mowing as one of your controls for weeds, you need to do that regularly enough that you don't lay down a heavy layer of residue, which provides actually awesome nesting habitat for voles and others. If you can get that vegetation broken up and leave it open and not have those brushy thick areas where our seed predators can hide, then raptors, our natural predators of the herbivores, can take care of them. So providing raptor perches is a great way, combined with opening up the vegetation to control those wildlife populations. I always think back to, in terms of wildlife perches, a savanna restoration I did in Southern Illinois, and that's probably one of the most difficult tree planting settings, because in a savanna setting, you're trying to maintain grass and trees in the same ecosystem. And so in looking at this site that was 4 or 5 years old, I noticed that a lot of those trees had a broken top or bent over top. And after visiting the site a couple of times and trying to assess the problems, we had some other issues going on with invasives there. I realized that every single one of those trees we planted out there was a raptor perch. And so it was hawks that were actually sitting in the tops of those trees and breaking the central leader of the tree, which is an arborist I know is one of the most important parts of that plant, and using it as a perch. So we provided some perches, and lo and behold, that some of the pressure on those trees was let up. I think it also might have just been a function of time. The trees grew out of that and provided better perches. But there's a lot of great designs online for raptor perches, from just a post with a T at the top, or, quite honestly, I've seen just T-posts, hawks sitting on just a T-post out there. Anything we can get that kind of gets them a good view of the site and gets them up, they'll probably use, and they can naturally kind of control those wildlife that's putting pressure on our trees that we planted. Repellents can work, and you'll see a lot of those in the form of sprays. They definitely require proper management and reapplication. And so I'm not saying they don't work, but if they aren't used correctly, they probably aren't very effective. So you really have to have a good plan. Repellents need to cover, not only the most of the trees in your planting, at least definitely the outside areas, but also a lot of those game trails that are leading into your site is where I focus a lot of my spraying of repellents. Is where are those sites, where are those animals accessing the site and coming in? And that's where I focus my spraying, where if you think of this kind of setting where we're reforesting a cornfield, I have less spray that I'm focusing on the center part of that field as I am the outer areas and those access paths and corridors. And that's probably the way I found that you get the best use out of repellents, but most of them are kind of natural products and require some reapplication after a rain. So, you know, that's just a caution with those. They can be effective, but have to be used correctly. And finally, you know, if you're worried about rodent populations, consider a pre-planting rodent survey. And I'll have a document to share here in a little bit that kind of has some details on that. But essentially, it's putting out some snap traps, seeing how many animals you catch before you ever plant trees to kind of estimate that population and prepare, you know, some of your control measures. So, and all of our different methods here, I hope to kind of review at the end, you know, what are some good applications of this method? What are some bad or some problematic things? So, you know, what are some of the best site conditions? Definitely a well-prepped site. So that site that you can get that nicely clean tilled soil surface prepared for planting, that's just the ideal location. Cropland, you know, like if it's a cornfield or a bean, you know, something that was in crop production before that we're going to reforest, gosh, that's just about the perfect site for this. Locations with no adjacent predator habitat. And by predator, it's getting a little confusing how I'm using the term predator here, but I mean predator of our plants. So the herbivores, so the mice, the voles, the squirrels, the deer. So locations that don't really have that adjacent habitat are great sites for this. Some of the worst sites, you know, old fields with established weed and wildlife pressure. If there's already a vole population there, if there's already turf grass there in place that's going to be difficult to control, those are some of the problem sites. Sites with a lot of heavy woody cover or slash. And by slash, I just mean, you know, either storm damage from trees that have came down. After a harvest, we have slash on the ground. So woody debris that's in the way of equipment and just doesn't allow access that well. Sites that frequently flood or have, you know, like my planting site I showed at the start of this as an example, I don't think I've tried direct seeding in those areas that are flooded. Those seeds wind up underwater for a huge chunk of time, and that can actually, you know, really compromise the germination capabilities of that seed. Erosion prone sites are bad. So if you have steep hills, highly erodible soils, all those things that kind of go together to make a highly erodible soil, that's a bad site for this because you can have some erosion problems because we have to have that cleanly tilled surface. And finally, you know, just sites that have limited access for equipment. I really view this method as something that you need to have equipment involved, at least for that initial tillage. Even if you're going to hand plant rows, you're going to need to have some equipment to kind of set the stage for that. And so finally, this is one of the better resources I found for Illinois, this direct seeding handbook. You can see it's a little dated from 2003, but a lot of the information is really good in here. They have some price lists and other things and vendors in the back. That's maybe the outdated part, but the methods, the practices they recommend, they talk about everything from, you know, your seed spacing and row spacing to rodent control. And, you know, if you wanted to do a pre-planting rodent survey, they would cover that as well. So that's probably the best recommendation for a resource I found there. So now let's talk about bare root seedlings. So this is probably one of the more common planting methods if I had to pick out of the three. And so in this case, we're going to go with about a 10 by 10 spacing. So that equates out to 436 trees per acre. So that's kind of the minimum rate or the standard rate at which we plant trees. So timing on this is really important, and it's really in the spring, you know, and I'm saying February through May is a loose description of spring, but that's due to the availability of the plant material. So they have to be dug during dormancy. They're available during dormancy, which is the winter season, for us to plant then in spring. So a couple different planting methods, from hand planting to there are actually tree planters out there you can hire or use to get your trees in the ground. So the pros, we don't have a germination risk. So with direct seeding, we have to have a seed that germinates. So we've already germinated a seed. We have them ready to go right there. Fewer predators. We don't have all those seed predators I listed are really not an issue here. We're really looking at voles, deer, and rabbits as the main predators of these seedlings. So we've eliminated, you know, mice and squirrels as kind of, you know, some of the predators. Pretty easy to get these trees in the ground, especially with hand planting. This is probably the type of planting I've done the most of in my career. Relatively cheap when we look at the cost of everything. It's a pretty cheap way to get a forest started. Some of the negative side, we don't have any flexibility on timing. You know, the care of these seedlings is very important ahead of time before they get to the field. I don't know how many times I've went out to a tree planting that a landowner was doing, and I could tell right away that planting material was dried out. was desiccated, was not in good condition before we even got it in the ground. So why go to all the work to get something in the ground that's already compromised? And it's harder to kind of assess your planting success in this case. And some of that's because these little seedlings kind of disappear into the weeds that we're trying to control. So sometimes it's hard if you're not good at tree ID, if you're not good at, recognizing a tree by its leaves, it's kind of hard to assess our planting success at times. And so that can be one of the challenges. So just some tips on handling and care. Really, the best thing I can tell you is to plant that little seedling as soon as practical. As you can see, this plant has very little energy. It's storing all of its energy in this root system, little bit of storage capacity in the trunk itself. So once this energy is depleted, that plant is out of luck. So we don't want to stress it out any more than it already is, because remember, it's been moved from a nursery to your house or your planting location, and now you're going to put it back out in the field. So that's pretty stressful for a plant. So refrigerated storage is absolutely the best. I realize that's not practical if you have hundreds and hundreds of seedlings to go out. So the next best thing is just a cool, dark, protected location. A concrete garage floor that has no light coming in would be wonderful. A basement floor, just wherever it is in your house or in your barn where you have a pretty shaded location that stays cool. Because again, moisture loss is the biggest thing we're trying to protect against. So in the field, I don't know how many times I've seen folks just pull out these seedlings. Like you see this one sitting here in the sun, you can see its shadow. Oh gosh, that's just the worst thing we can do with the seedling. So have a plan for a field storage site where you're going to store them out of the sun, out of the wind and the elements, whether that's under a shade tree, whether that's just at a close location where there's a garage or a shed or some type of roof. I've even seen pretty good field storage underneath a trailer that, you maybe haul the stuff there to do the planting on. You can tuck it in the shade underneath a trailer or a truck. Plan for how you're going to transport from your field storage site to the planting hole. They make really great planting bags that can carry a ton of trees. There's a lot of different ways you can protect that root system all the way up to the time you're putting it in the hole. So don't just don't expose that sensitive little seedling unless you have to. So just a little bit on the actual installation. So, mechanical planting is possible. There's seed planting apparatuses that we pull behind a tractor that can do a great job of planting, but it requires experience. So without experience, we can have pretty variable finished products. And I know this from inspecting, thousands of acres of tree plantings over the years and seeing crooked trees that are planted too deep, trees that are planted too shallow. And that's equipment operation is the key to success with a mechanical planter. So it's really something that probably for a lot of us, we should hire out if we want to mechanically plant our trees. But it's better suited to large sites with good access. So again, a smaller site or a site with obstacles where, it's difficult to drive equipment through is not going to be good for this. Hand planting is much more practical and can be accomplished with the dibble bar, a forestry planting bar, I guess is what we kind of refer to that as a lot. And that's about, a 36-inch tall tool there that you simply stick in the ground, make a slit and stick your seedling in afterwards. Pretty quick and easy, pretty easy to operate. The one thing you do have to do is make sure as you close that hole, you kind of stamp on the hole, don't have an air pocket in there. And that's the biggest mistake I've seen is where folks didn't quite get the hole closed. There's an air pocket. And so those roots, again, kind of dry out from exposure to the air. Layout can be challenging in the field for both hand planting of seedlings and for hand planting of direct seeding. And I've seen actually folks do a really good job of direct seeding using these planting bars. So that's another tool that's available for hand planting with seeds. But it pays to use some flags, to use some markers, some stakes to kind of lay out your rows so you can kind of stay straight and stay oriented to where you've already planted. So what are some of the best uses for bare root seedlings? Well, reforestation of cropland really lends well to this because you have a nice open area, you have low weed pressure. Interplanting into existing stands is another great use for little bare root seedlings like this. Now, you need to have an opening already there, so you need to have some gaps in your canopy, or you need to have a future canopy disturbance planned like a harvest, where really the best recommendation ahead of any type of timber harvest is to ensure you already have adequate regeneration or seedlings in the understory. If you're just not getting that and you've already tried some timber stand improvement, some thinning of the understory, some other things to try and get some seedlings in there, this is one way you can add those, is by adding seedlings into the existing stand. But you need to plan for that. You need to understand these seedlings need some light, so they need to have an opening. You can't plant in full shade and expect those seedlings to do well. So a supplement to a failed planting. So there's times that I've used these to go back in and supplement a direct seeding. We've direct, so we have about the same, we maybe have areas where that direct seeding germination failed in spots. So we can go back in, we can fill in with these seedlings. For harder to access sites, this is a great plant material to use. You can pack a ton of those into a bag and hike into a location where you can't get equipment into for some of the other methods we'll talk about. So they're just widely adaptable in how you can apply them. So for those harder to access sites, this is probably my plant material of choice. Problematic sites, anything with heavy woody cover or slash in the way. If you're trying to achieve that 10 by 10 spacing and you can't do that because there's treetops everywhere, that's a pretty difficult site to plant into. If you have a lot of woody invasives that you removed and left in place, that can be a difficult site to plant into on 10 by 10 spacing. Sites with heavy deer pressure or a high vole population are not the best sites, because if you, again, think about this little seedling with a tiny bit of energy coming with it in a tiny top, if a deer mows off that top or if a vole damages the bark or chews it away, it doesn't have a lot of an energy reserve to fall back to. So that can be pretty detrimental to seedlings. Now let's talk about containerized trees. So again, I'm talking about, plants that are anywhere from 1 to probably up to 5 gallon size, and they come in that container. Our minimum rate is typically going to be about 50 trees per acre. And remember, for seedlings, that was 436 trees per acre. So we're planting quite a bit less trees per acre in this case, and we're spacing them out more. So about 30 by 30 foot spacing is what you need for about 50 trees per acre. Timing's a little variable. You can plant them in the spring, you can plant them in the fall. I think fall's kind of best, just because you're not cruising right into the hot weather where, I list here too late in spring can really be a disaster. And that's happened for me on several just large scale tree plantings where, just due to weather, due to a number of different factors, we were planting really late in the spring with these containerized plants. I just watched them roast over the summer then, and there was nothing we could do because we had too many acres planted to actually go provide water to any of those. So really the method I recommend is hand planting. A lot of folks try and use machinery for this, and I think there's just it's different. I really don't like a soil auger for planting trees. It makes a really smooth and hard edge on that planting hole that roots have a hard time getting out of. So really, all in all, I found the best method is just simply hand planting. So to look at some of the pros and cons, some of the pros are larger trees sooner, and I put presumably there because I can show you some good sites in Southern Illinois where tree seedlings have outgrown container plants on different sites. And that's just for a variety of reasons. If you look at those 10, 20 years down the road, there's times where I can think of specific examples where either planting stock has produced the same size tree down the road. So, but for visual purposes, immediately out in the field, you see those bigger trees, and maybe that's what you're going for. Maybe that's, of enough benefit to you that you want to do that right away. So you're planting a larger root mass. So there's a greater energy reserve there. There's a greater ability to kind of survive some environmental stress with a larger root mass. There could be much, much less site prep. So we'll talk about that when we kind of look at good and bad planting sites. You can plant into heavy slash with these because you only have to find a planting hole every 30 feet as opposed to every 10 feet. There's maybe less weed control we can do with these because they are a little bit more competitive. They're taller than some of the weeds if we knock everything back at the start with some good site preparation. On the negative side, they are expensive, and the eggs in one basket concept applies here, where you've got a lot of eggs in one basket every 30 feet in each one of these trees, and they're pretty expensive, $15 to $25 a tree or so. And so you risk a lot in losing those. Handling of any of these materials, including direct seeds, there's so many variables when we get out in the field, from weather, from other conditions, that you know, the one thing we can control ahead of a planting is how we handle this plant material in most cases. So I can't stress enough, like the larger the plant, the more important this pre-planting care is. So that's a negative, is that we're going to have to water these plants if they're sitting for any amount of time. So they're difficult to plant. You know, transplant shock is a factor in these trees. And transplanting shock is just that shock a plant goes through when it's moved from its nursery to its new planting site. It's safe to say the larger the tree, the more the plant transplant shock it's going to have to go through before it adapts to the site. And finally, we're probably much more limited. This is probably our most limited source of plant material in species selection. So if you're going for diversity, another method may be better for you to think about. So in handling and care, again, we're going to store these in a protected area, keep them well watered, plant as soon as possible. That's really the best plan. And I know weather and other things often inhibit our ability to plant, but we really need to be getting those in the ground as soon as possible. If we're not able to get them in the ground, I really don't recommend storing them in a super sunny spot, assuming it's just a little while that we're going to be nursing them along, and hopefully they don't have leaves. Hopefully it's in the fall after leaves have dropped, the plants are dormant, or in the spring when they're dormant. So hopefully we don't have leaves to worry about. We can store them in the shade so they're not drying out, and keep them well watered, because whatever nursery they came from, it's pretty sure bet they've kept them pretty watered in the nursery, and that's what that plant's used to. So another big recommendation is protect those trunks during transport. And I've seen too many times just giant piled up truck bed of these container trees with the stems getting bent and pressed against other pots. And so you really need to plan for a good method of transport. And ideally it has those trees kind of standing up or spaced or leaning over and spaced out. So in the field, keep the plants in their pot until you get to the planting hole. You shouldn't be exposing that root system like you see here until you're right at that planting hole, at that planting location. The longer those roots are exposed, the more they're drying out. I've seen where folks were pulling them out of the pots and stacking them along the field edge for planters to come grab. Not the best plan. So really keep them in the pots, carry them by the pots, not by the stem. You can damage that stem by carrying it by the stem, and just protect them again from exposure, just like we would with seedlings in the field. So it pays to pay attention to planting depth. So there's a little bit more to installing these plants. It's just really, as an arborist, I know it's just an incredibly important factor for trees that they're planted at the right depth. And this is an example of a containerized tree that was in the container at about this depth. And before I planted it, I tried to find, again, this root flare structure. So that's what we want at the soil surface. And as I dug down below this, it was about 4 or 5 inches deeper that I actually found this root flare. And that's the case with most containerized plants. A lot of them are in that container a little too deep. So if you plant the pot at the depth the plant at the depth it was in the pot, it's already planted too deep, and that's one strike against that plant as it goes into the field. So identify that root flare and make sure your plants are getting in right at the level of that root flare. And last thing here is a good planting hole is wide and shallow. And I know a lot of us start digging a real deep hole, but wide and shallow is what we need. Remember that root flare may be buried in the ball, so that may in the pot, it may be down in the pot, so that makes a shallower hole to get it at the proper depth. And tree roots are concentrated in that upper 12 to 18 inches of soil, so we don't need a super deep hole. The wider we can make it, the more loose soil those roots have to expand out into. So a wider hole is much better than a skinnier hole. But I realize out in the field, there's some compromises for how much time we can spend digging each hole. So you have to kind of strike a balance. So what are some of the best uses for container trees? Really, they're honestly suitable to most any site, but they're the most expensive. So that's the big consideration. This is the most expensive planting stock you can buy. So I've really found them incredibly useful in smaller or more irregular planting sites that are difficult to access sometimes, that are really small, are good sites for a container planting, because you can go in and plant on 30 by 30 spacing and fill that site relatively quickly. Interplanting into existing stands is a great way to diversify your planting stock. So to diversify the species on your site, but you need to have those openings already present in the canopy to plant into. So I've done this in my own woodland here in Central Illinois. I've bought container trees to kind of plunk into some of the openings because I have ash trees that are falling out of the stand. So I'm each fall, I'm adding some container oaks to replace those ash. Sites with deer pressure, this can actually be a good way where other methods have failed because of deer pressure. I've came back and we've went all in and said, this is a high priority area. We're going to fence and exclude those trees. So you can see right there, a fencing exclosure on a T-post. And I know that takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of energy. That's why I say high priority areas is maybe where we would focus this on. But in some cases where heavy deer pressure eliminated seedlings over time, we've came back with really targeted, well-planned planting of container plants and just all out fenced them away from the deer to keep the deer off of them. And it's probably the most expensive thing you can do, but when all else has failed, that's maybe kind of a last resort. What are some of the problematic sites? Really large sites with limited access where you're going to have to carry these in. That's just almost not practical. So that's probably one of the worst type sites, is a big one with little access. Sites with heavy deer pressure are also problematic because, again, we've got a plant that's right up there at eye level for these deer and is tasty in the wintertime. So, on the same side of the coin, it can be a good, solution to deer pressure, but also can be on the negative side.
Ryan, just to note that we're really running in at the end of our hour here.
Okay, I think I've just got maybe a couple quick slides left. Thanks, Chris. This is just kind of a reminder on post-planting weed control. I mean, that's probably the biggest follow-up you have once you establish them, and just kind of have some points here. A 2 to 3 foot diameter of a weed-free zone is the best to apply. A note there on taller weeds block the sun, but can also block out our, herbivores, our predators of those plants. So sometimes it's striking a balance, and on a site that has wet soil, that has a more mesic site, that has more moisture on the site, that I feel like, it has good soils, trees are going to grow productively on. Sometimes we've let weeds go a little longer to kind of block the deer pressure from those plants. So it's kind of striking a balance there between letting those weeds get too tall and outcompete the plants, but kind of hiding your plants in there at times too. So I know I'm saying a couple different things that, control weeds, but also you can leave them at times. So it depends on the site. You have to have really productive soils to be okay with a little weed pressure. And again, it's, those annual weeds that we're kind of controlling for. So, so what about natural regeneration? I get this question a lot, like all that light seeded stuff that comes in. It's something you can plan for as part of your mixture in your tree planting, but some of these sites I've learned over the years, natural regeneration may only be the fit, maybe the only fit, just because that's what's going to come in and compete. And here's, kind of a picture of maybe 15 or 20-year-old tree planting near my house in Central Illinois that is just a monotypic stand of silver maple. You can see just the infinity of silver maple stems there. I can find just a couple little oak seedlings that were planted here and are just tiny. So in this case, the silver maple pressure was just so enormous because this is one crop field surrounded by floodplain forest. It just really didn't do well. I don't know the follow-up care and think maybe follow-up care was skipped, but there's a time and a place where natural regeneration gives us some diversity, is something we can plan for on sites. It's something where, when our planted stock fails, there may be some places where some of this natural regeneration or light seeded stuff can fill in some of those areas. So it's something not necessarily to discount, but to understand it can also compete with our growing stock as well and be an issue. So when do you replant? Here's just kind of some recommendations. So with a direct seeding, when your survival drops below 500 to 800 trees per acre, you're going to probably look to reseeding. For bare root seedlings, when survival drops below about 70%. So initially we planted at 436 trees per acre. 70% of that is 300. So when we get down to around 300 trees per acre, that's when we need to think about restocking that site because stocking's getting a little too low. I put a note there that late winter tree counts are the best. In my opinion, that's when I would go do all my bare root seedling planting assessments, because you can really see those little tree stems out there and you can almost count them every 10 feet. amongst, kind of the weeds that are kind of dying off for the wintertime. So for container trees, it's really dependent on the site and the situation. So you can't let the site get too low in stocking or tree density, or it turns into a weed patch and really becomes difficult to manage. So it's highly dependent on the site and kind of the setting. If you have questions about this, where do you go for more help? Illinois Extension maintains this directory of professional consulting foresters you can hire to come out and help you plan some of these things. Also, the IDNR has district foresters in every area of the state, and this is the most current kind of map of their distribution and who to contact. So you can find both of these pieces of information on the web, and I encourage you to seek professional help if you need it before you start this tree planting. It can be something you can do on your own. It can be a do-it-yourself project, but it needs to be planned well. And so with that, we'll go to any questions we had, and I have my contact information posted here. If you guys want a copy of this presentation, I did not get it to Chris in time for him to share out to all of you, but please shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you a PDF version of this.